So this is what we're doing here, and since a lot of it, of course, when it started, there was less research, but thanks for people like Annika, we have a lot more research now. So we have a research library on our website, which you're welcome to go, manhavingbabies.org/research. And we would love to get more studies that you hear about and add them to that library. So please, why don't you share with us your insights and research?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm actually quite impressed by this huge audience. You should all come to my academic conferences, where there's like 5 people in the audience. So yeah, this is actually a little bit intimidating. You know, as medical anthropologists, we are not used to this kind of interest. Okay, so yes, I'm just gonna talk briefly a little bit about my research and about research results. And yes, Ron asked me to sort of focus on a few things, but if you have additional questions, please just come and ask. I also have a list of publications which I'm happy to share. So yeah, I mean, as you have already heard, like there's not that much research on surrogacy, especially in Germany, but also in other European countries. It's become better, but to my knowledge, until today, even though I've worked on this for 10 years now, I'm the only person who's doing research on Germany, which I find quite interesting because, you know, it's in the media quite a bit and it's talked about a lot and there's public interest in it. But I think the problem really is, first of all, that funding agencies, so that really is a problem, are not so happy to fund this kind of research. And the other thing really is that it's very difficult to find people who want to talk to us. But fortunately, I did find people who were happy to talk to me. And yes, so the existing research where there's like much more is like law, of course. There's like discussions about different legal approaches in different countries, and especially what is very interesting and what's also important for you, since you can't do surrogacy in Germany, that surrogacy arrangements sort of done by German or like other European parents are usually transnational. And that like you end up in a situation where different legal systems may clash or not, depending on where you go. So there's quite a bit of legal research on these kinds of issues. Then, of course, bioethics. It's a very classical topic to discuss in bioethics, gender studies, of course, philosophy, psychology, theology, and so on. But there's very little empirical research, as you can see here. And this is sort of how I came to this topic. And also the thing is, if you do look at the research that is there, the main interest is in surrogates and their experiences, which I think is extremely important. But there is already like very wonderful research out there. Like Heather Jacobson, for example, is a colleague of mine who I work with very closely, who has also presented at Men Having Babies conferences, or Marcin Smetana. So there are quite a few people who've worked with surrogates, but very rarely with intended parents. So that was the starting point of my research. I really wanted to learn about like the reasons why people decide to do surrogacy, how they experience surrogacy, like the whole process of becoming parents through surrogacy. But also, and this is what I find very important and what I've done quite extensively, staying with the people, sort of learning how their relationship develops over the years. So there's, for example, one couple I've been working with since 2013. So I know both of their children. They are like 8 years old. I have accompanied them and I've talked to them regularly, and I've gone with them to the US. I've been there for egg retrieval and so on and so on. So these are like really close relationships and long-term accompaniment of people, and not just one interview. I mean, I do have people who I interview once and then they say, okay, I don't have anything else to say, but there are also quite a lot of people I'm accompanying long term. And these are both like heterosexual couples and also gay couples and other kinds of constellations. So this is sort of the background to my research. And then from there, I started, sort of talking to the other people involved. So my background, as I already said, is medical anthropology. So that's like the focus of this kind of research is really qualitative research. Sort of a negative presentation would be anecdotal research. But I think that, if we have numbers, it's really important to look at numbers, but it's also really important if you want to learn more about these, or if you look more want to look more in depth into these kinds of issues, you really have to, you have to build a relationship with the people you're talking to, and you really have to learn more about why they do things and how they do them and how they experience them. So this is sort of the methodology I'm using. So I've worked with like mainly intended parents from Germany and Switzerland, and I've like the two places where I've done field work. So field work means like sort of long-term stays. There was in the US, in California, and also in Ukraine. So I did like several weeks of research in Ukraine in 2019. And worked with quite a few surrogates and other people involved in surrogacy. So I already mentioned I mainly do interviews, but I also do something that in anthropology we call participant observation, which means that I really, like I'm there, so I'm spending time in the clinic, I'm spending time in agencies, I go into the operating theater and I join egg retrieval and these kinds of things. So that's another kind of methodology I'm using. So I already said that I've talked and worked with intended parents, surrogates, and I also know quite a few children. So I haven't explicitly interviewed children because ethically that's a bit of a tricky thing. But I do know several children, and I've done interviews with agency staff in different countries, with fertility doctors, lawyers, attorneys. And I've also talked, and this is, I think, also very interesting, with people here who are confronted with surrogacy and don't really know what to do with it. So this is like embassy staff who process the documents. This is also registrars in German, what is it, like Bürgeramt or something, where you have to sort of register your children and so on and so on. Because for them sometimes it's also very difficult because it doesn't really matter what they personally think, but they have rules they have to adhere to. And they can also sort of, they can also negotiate a little bit, but there's also, this perspective is also really interesting to see how these arrangements, how people experience them. So I think one of the main results, which I think is also really important to keep in mind, that surrogacy is not one thing. Surrogacy can be practiced in very different ways, in different places, in different, be organized in very different ways. And so it can be done in very ethical ways. And a lot of the criticism of surrogacy mainly looks at the very problematic ways surrogacy can be practiced. And of course, that is happening all over the world. I think, we cannot deny that. And I think the important thing is that it's really like for you or for people who want to do surrogacy to really learn more about like what would be ways to do it ethically. Because it is definitely possible. I know a lot of families who have done it in ways where all the people involved in the surrogacy are happy and have good relationships. But this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But that really depends on which country you go to, which agency you work with, and how the whole process is organized. So like the kind of data I have is very varied, and there's a huge spectrum. What I'm going to talk about today is like how can it be done and how are the experiences when it works well. But I'm also going to tell you maybe a few little stories where stuff became problematic and why that happened and how that could perhaps be avoided. So my suggestion is to not talk about surrogacy, but to talk about surrogacies in the plural. But that's, of course, more of a conceptual thing I use in my academic paper. So in this presentation, I'm going to continue to talk about surrogacy in the singular. So I have divided this small presentation into 3 sections because I think at the moment you're probably less interested in the experiences of registrars or embassy staff. So I'm mainly going to talk about surrogates, intended parents, and children. But again, we can also, in the discussion, we can talk about these the other issues or the other actors as well. So if you look at sort of the assumption, especially in public discourse and especially when it comes to criticism, so I'm really sort of opposing these like 2 very different views, then you are probably all familiar with this argument that surrogates become surrogates because of financial need, because they are desperate, especially financially desperate, because there's structural violence. So structural violence means that the structures within which they live, for example, that like extreme poverty or things like abusive relationships, and so on. So you probably have all heard these stories about surrogacy. So this is like one of the assumptions, especially when you look at surrogacy from sort of a critical perspective. Then there's also very often this idea that a surrogate gives away her own child, or she sells her child, which is also one of these arguments. And also that surrogates do not want to hand over the child, but are forced to do so. So there's also this idea, and especially in anthropology, that's like really interesting, that there is this like natural bond between a carrying person and the child she carries. And if you look in history, there, like you can see that there's a huge range. You know, this natural bond between people who carry children and between the children has historically not been there, and it's also like if you look at different cultures, not necessarily there. So that's very much a cultural idea of the relationship between the person who carries a child and the child. And also the idea of what that bond is. Is that bond just that I'm sort of, you know, I'm having positive feelings towards this fetus, or does it mean I cannot part from it ever? You know, so there's a lot of variation in these ideas, but it's definitely also something that we as anthropologists at least would argue is very much cultural, less than biological or natural. And then the other point, of course, and I think that's an important point to look at, is the question of exploitation. Is the person exploited? Who carries the child? Is she, and I'm using she here, although I would also want to include every other kind of gender identity, but since all the people I've worked with identified as cis women, I'm saying she here now. So there's this idea of exploitation and commodification, so that surrogates are exploited, that they definitely are in the weaker position, that they are sort of forced into doing it, and also this commodification, so that they are made into a commodity, or they are made into just like a means of production, maybe from a Marxist point of view. Yes, and so I have to admit that this is also where I came from when I began the project. But as I said, like in our earlier talk today, the beauty of anthropology is that we learn from the people we work with. So when I began doing surrogacy, like research on surrogacy, that was my idea. Of course, I was also really strongly influenced by the discourses that were around at the time. And then I began talking to surrogates, and I began talking to intended parents, and I began spending time with them. And then I realized that the whole thing is so much more complex. And as I said, there are so many different ways of doing these things, and that there are actually arrangements which are working out extremely well and enriching for the people involved. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It depends on how it's organized, but it's definitely possible. And I know a lot of people for whom this is how it works out. So it can be a very positive experience for the people involved, and not only for the intended parents, but really also for the surrogates. Especially Heather Jacobson has done incredible research with surrogates in the US. Also, there are quite a few surrogates who, and Heather has described that in her research, and that's also something that some of the surrogates I worked with told me, that this moment of handing over the child to the parents, that is like such an extremely enriching and rewarding experience. So this idea that it's difficult to hand over the child, and this idea that surrogates do not want to part with the child, there are quite a few surrogates who experience it differently. And again, it doesn't have to be that way for everyone, but there are a lot of surrogates who describe that for them, this moment of giving the child to the intended parents who they've been in contact with for a long time, and sort of seeing the joy and the happiness and also the gratefulness is something that some surrogates have even described as that they are addicted to this, which sort of made them want to do it again. And this also goes hand in hand with this feeling of being appreciated and of giving something special, of doing something nobody else can do, or of helping people to build a family. Also, if you look at surrogates in the US, they're actually, and I haven't put that in here, there are actually quite a few surrogates who are very religious. That would be completely different in Germany. But some of the surrogates I spoke with also actually claimed their faith and this idea of, or this appreciation of having a family as a reason why they wanted to become surrogates. So as some kind of altruistic action to, or an altruistic act to sort of help others build a family. So this is like one of the ways it can work out if it's done in an ethical way. And again, I'm happy to tell you more about the interviews I did with surrogates. So the second thing is like the second topic, of course, is intended parents, and of course that's particularly interesting for you too. So very often intended parents who have participated in my research, especially in Germany, told me that they were accused of buying a child. So of course that's a very, very tricky thing, and it's also very difficult to discuss because there is a child handed over and somehow money is flowing around. So this is one of these assumptions, and also one of the problems, or one of the accusations perhaps. Also another assumption is that intended parents are just like rich people who buy a child, who exploit the surrogate and don't respect her, and are just interested in what, from this perspective, is claimed to be a product, the child. And if you look at media reports, these kinds of terms, like the terminology, keeps coming up again and again. So the child is product and exploitation and these kinds of things. And then there's also this accusation, especially when it comes to people like, I don't know, Nicole Kidman, for example. She was one of the early examples who was accused of being too lazy to carry a child and not wanting to ruin her body and so on and so on. So especially with heterosexual couples. Or also, and this of course also applies to queer parents, that they're unwilling to adopt the child. And at least in my research, the empirical data is completely different. So especially the cis women I interviewed, for them that was really sort of the greatest pain of was not being able to carry a child, because especially in Germany, where there's this myth of motherhood, a lot of the women who cannot carry children feel like they are not real women. And of course for gay parents this is not really an issue, which is also of course why they are usually not accused of being too lazy to carry a child. But there's also very often this idea, okay, why don't you adopt? And I mean, you probably all know that if you look into adoption, especially in Germany, until recently as a gay couple you could not adopt the child. Also as a straight couple you could not adopt the child if, for example, you have a history of cancer, which for many women is the reason why they also cannot carry a child, because they've lost their uterus, for example. So that a lot of the people that are participating in my research would have loved to carry a child or adopt the child, but didn't even have this option. And also, if you look at the numbers, so usually you have 10 parent couples for one child, or who want to adopt. So this is, of course, also an issue which is really important, and one of the things that that sort of are at least some kind of a little bit skewed version of what's actually going on. So within this research, the issue of money, as I just said, sort of if you look at my research, that's of course a very tricky thing also when you talk to either intended parents or surrogates. Because we're all somehow this idea of reproduction and money that doesn't really go together. That's also very similar to if you look at the discussions about sex work. So it's this kind of intimacy and money, for many, within our culture at least, that's something that feels uncomfortable when it comes together. But in most cases, the intended parents I work with, see it more as some kind of paying for the effort and not for the child or for the service, but really sort of as a way of appreciating somebody's efforts and also the risk, because of course every pregnancy is a risk. And the other thing is that, like many intended parents I worked with, not all of them, but most, actually have very close relationships with the surrogate. And many of them keep in contact. The surrogate, in some cases, becomes like a member of an extended family. Maybe she's like the godmother or something like that. They visit each other, and this doesn't always happen, but it happens quite often. So I actually have worked with quite a few families who have a long-term relationship with a surrogate. And very early on in my research, I interviewed a surrogate in the US who had carried a child like a long time before, like 16 years before, for, I think, Danish parents. And after, I think, like 14, 15 years, and they had kept in contact, but not regularly. They were Facebook friends, but that was it. And after after 14, 15 years, she was contacted by the child she had carried, and the child said, you know what, like for my exchange year, I want to go to the US and I want to stay with you. And then she was a bit worried because she thought like, okay, this is some kind of teenage rebellion, and now, you know, the child is gonna, it wants to annoy its parents by saying like, I'm gonna go and stay with my surrogate. So she rang the parents and said like, listen, you know, I think we need to talk. And it turned out that it was actually their idea, because they said they felt that she would be the best person for the child to stay with, because they assumed and they hoped, and this was the case here too, that as the person who had carried the child, as the person who did have like a good relationship with the family, she would actually be the best person to look after the child when it's in the US. So what happened then was the child stayed with her, and she said whenever they went shopping in the supermarket, the child was like, oh, look, this is my surrogate, this is my surrogate. And so, you know, it's these little anecdotes that make my research so enjoyable. And then later, her own children, the surrogate's children, she had a son who was younger, stayed for his exchange year with a family in Denmark. So this is one of the examples, and not all families work like that, and it really depends on, you know, what the different members of these like whole, you know, of this setting, of this relationship web, what they feel comfortable with. But these are also the kinds of relationships that can emerge out of surrogacy contracts. And this is also where we see that this transnational setting is really a problem, because like a lot of the people I work with, they say that this time difference already is such an obstacle to stay in regular contact, to talk. Time difference, then also the huge geographic distance to visit each other is extremely expensive, it's difficult, and so on. So this is really what makes these transnational settings problematic, and or not problematic, but what makes it more difficult. So if, for example, you look at studies of surrogacy arrangements within one country, staying in contact and sort of seeing each other regularly is, of course, much easier. And then finally, the third issue, or the third point I wanted to talk about is of course, the question about the children. And as I said, I haven't strictly interviewed children, but I've spoken to children. It depends on, like, different countries have different laws, and a lot of these laws are based on cultural ideas about what a family should look like. So, for example, in the Swiss law only permits assisted reproductive technologies which could have theoretically taken place in nature. So this is really this argument of nature in Switzerland. In Germany, if you look at the law, it's very much based on this idea that children who do not have two clear parents will become confused and will later suffer with identity problems. So if they do not know who their father or their mother is, so of course it's a very heteronormative idea, then it will confuse them, and also it will sort of lead to some kind of identity problems, and also this, which I think is a very important point also, if they do not know where they come from, also genetically. So this is like one argument. The other one is this like feeling of being bored. And then there's this argument which every kind of family that differs from the heteronormative model will encounter at some point, is this argument, but your child will be discriminated against. So this is sort of, these are some of the assumptions. And then in my research, this is really not representative of my own research. All the children I know who were born through surrogacy, to me, seem perfectly happy. But this is not quantitative data. I'm not a psychologist. But there is a research group in Cambridge which has been doing research on third-party reproduction for almost 30 years now. It's called Center for Family Research, and it's a psychological research unit, so that they do everything very, very properly. So they do quantitative questionnaires, surveys, they do like psychological surveys, and so on, and examinations, and this and that, and they talk to the parents and the teachers and everyone. So this is like really extremely solid research, and it's long-term, it's longitudinal research. So their research has been going on for 30 years. They just published a paper, so they've published many papers, but they just published a new paper which came out like 2 or 3 weeks ago, where they published their newest results about the children who were born through, with the help of third-party reproduction. So this is, of course, surrogacy, but it's also egg donation and sperm donation. And this is really like the results about the children. So they had interviewed the children they had sort of interacted with the children when they were 1 year old, 3 years old, 7 years old, 14, and 20, or maybe even more, so I don't remember the exact numbers. So, but this was like with the same group of children, they sort of followed them for 20 years. And the results of this research, and I think that is really interesting, is that these children, that they don't show any psychological abnormalities, they don't show any issues with, they don't have any identity crises or anything, they have a good relationship with their parents. And of course, there are also children who are maybe, who do have difficulties, but there's if you do a statistical analysis, there's no difference to what we would call like the general population. And in my own research, the families I work with, like every single family, and especially the ones who were worried before their children were born, who were worried, how will this be when the child is there? How will be what will the reactions be like? How will people deal with us? And all of them are really surprised how normal they are. Like they are really normal with heterosexual couples. Of course, it's not so visible. So, but I do work with some couples who are very open about it. Everybody knows about it, and it's interesting maybe for the first couple of weeks, and after that, nobody asks. It's just that's what it's like. And even with gay couples, where of course you see that in the beginning, it's like two men or like other queer family settings where it's pretty obvious that somebody else must have been involved. Again, there might be some interest, and I mean, maybe, the people here have experienced it differently, but the people who I've interviewed all say, okay, in the beginning, maybe people find it a bit weird, or they ask, or they're interested, but in the end, they have like they also are sleep deprived, they also have to drive their children to all sorts of weird things, and have to, have really annoying birthday parties and stuff, and really, it's pretty normal. So, and this is interesting because it's a term every single intended parent I've talked to has at some point mentioned. It's like how normal it is. And I think that's, it probably would have been different 20, 30 years ago, but this is the experiences people are reporting to me as a researcher. Also, as this research, like the Center for Family Research, shows that these children have good relations with their parents, perhaps not better or worse than other children, but in general, there's no difference from other families. And the interesting thing is that for these children, the parentage is really clear, and it's completely clear who are the parents, and that really depends on the particular setting. These children can have more than 2 parents. It really depends on the respective family, how they set up their family, how they live together as a family. But I haven't met any family where it wasn't clear who belongs to whom. And that also involves, for example, I did interviews with 2 women who are in their 30s and who were born through surrogacy in the UK 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago, and both were born through traditional surrogacy. So their surrogate was also their genetic mother or their genetic parent, or we would say the genetrix in anthropology. None of them ever questioned that their social mother was also their real mother. So this idea of who's your real mother doesn't really come up because the parentage is completely clear. And it might be that some children, when they're teenagers, sort of start, that there's some kind of rebellion and problems. But again, these kinds of things do not differ from other families. So I think many actually wondered whether they were their real parents. But one thing that the study showed, and one thing that also psychologists, for example, Petra Thorne, who some of you may know, has also emphasized is that, for the children, the most important thing is that there's very early disclosure. So that from early on, children know where they come from, how they've come into existence, and who's involved. Okay, I'm almost done, I think. So, sorry, I've talked too long. So finally, just to sort of sum up, so the prerequisites for a positive experience are, others will talk about that also tomorrow, a solid legal framework so that it's clear, so that things that you talked about before don't happen where, it's unclear where these children belong, citizenship or parentage and so on. The communication between the different parties, careful matching, of course, and respect, continued contact after delivery is something that all surrogates I spoke with said was really important to them, that they don't just give birth and then afterwards, intended parents are not interested in them anymore. That is something that afterwards makes the experience really negative. Early disclosure, and also these avoiding family secrets and not telling children where they come from. And finally, every single family I interviewed said that they were really worried about discrimination, as I said before, stigmatization, but also criminalization, that maybe they will get into legal trouble. Eventually, every single family I've talked with haven't really encountered these kinds of things. And they said they were surprised that if they told people their story, that they actually got a lot of positive feedback. So usually the fears of these kinds of things were much worse than what people actually experienced, which doesn't mean it can happen, but it's very unlikely. And actually society is a little bit more open than these kinds of media reports and stuff sometimes suggest. So in many cases, people have actually had quite a lot of positive experiences. So, sorry for talking. Okay. So just, so I have a couple of papers up there that I wrote if you're interested, but it's very academic.
Thank you so much.